All right. So like Robert said, I'm going to be talking about using beaver as a restoration tool in streams and wetlands and floodplains. So before I jump right in, I just wanted to give you an outline so you know where we're going to go. We're going to do this talk in 3 different parts. So first, I'll give you a little bit of a background about the history of the North American beaver population. And then I'll talk about impacts of beaver dams onto streams, and then the use of Beaver Dam Analogs as a restoration technique. And then we'll talk about the Beaver Habitat Assessment Project that Clark Fork Coalition has implemented, what we've accomplished so far, and what we plan on doing in the future. And then I'll talk about some restoration projects that CFC has implemented in the Upper Clark Fork Basin, mainly on Modesty Creek and Perkins Gulch. So a little bit of a background. Historically, in North America, the beaver population inhabited all the areas in the dark gray. And they currently have inhabited most of their range since the great fur trapping industry. But the current population is about 1/10 of historic levels. And one thing I wanted to say was that there are 2 species of beaver in the world. There's the Eurasian beaver, and then castor fiber, and then the North American beaver. So it's all just one species of beaver in North America. So the North American fur trade was really the main driver for the degradation of the beaver population in North America. It began as early as the 1500s and went all the way through the 1800s. The main driver was the fact that it was so economically valuable back then. And that's because beaver hats were just so popular. It was just a mainstay in European fashion in many different styles dating back, way back, what's that say, 15, I know it's hard to read, it's a little blurry, but anyhow, very popular. And what happened was the Eurasian beaver had been completely wiped out. And so people came from all over the world to North America to seek out the pelts of beavers in North America. And so there was a lot of competition between people from Russia, Spain, France, Britain, all trying to get as many beavers as they could for their pelts. And then you couple that with after the fur trade settlement, European settlement and grazing, and it's a recipe for an extremely altered landscape. So what you see today, I mean, is most likely very different out there, especially in the valleys, than what was here historically. And so you couple the removal of beavers with grazing, and it has led to widespread incision. And I'm sure this is something that you've seen just out and about in your daily life. And so what do I mean by incision? Essentially, incision is where the channel bed drops. And so when, say, you remove a beaver dam that's been holding back a lot of sediment, then the stream is able to erode, and then the flows become trapped in this channel, and it just is kind of this self-perpetuating cycle. And so in a healthy stream environment, you have your flood flows are able to reach out onto the floodplain, and you have this connection of the water table into the floodplain. And so it allows for the riparian zone to really be rich and healthy and have the ability to thrive. And so there's been some conceptual models that have been developed for this. So this is out of Pollock et al. 2014. I thought it was a nice graphic. But you start here where you have your stream in sort of this healthy dynamic equilibrium, and then say you have some sort of erosional event and the channel becomes incised, and so you see the elevation of the water table down here has dropped, and so the trees in the floodplain cannot access the water table, and so they die off. And then what happens over time, so our scale is like 10 years, or I'm sorry, 0 to 10 years, and then within 10 years you start to see this widening happening. And because the flood flows, they can't reach the floodplain, so they just eat at the banks, and it widens and widens and widens. And so then you get this inset floodplain that develops. And so here then the riparian vegetation is like stuck in this incised corridor. And then what can happen over time is, say there's some depositional event that occurs, and the bed can aggrade or build back up. And so the theory is that you can then bring it back to this dynamic equilibrium through sediment deposition. So here's an example of an incised stream. So this is where I studied for my master's degree. This is Bridge Creek in Central Oregon. It's a tributary to the John Day River. And it's like a classic example of an incised stream. And you see this out here too all the time. The story goes on this stream, it's just really heavy grazing. And so that stream becomes incised. There are beavers that are currently living in this stream, but they have a really hard time surviving because their dams just get blown out. But anyway, you can see the narrow band of vegetation. And so it's just, what am I trying to say? Degraded, I guess. It's just, the riparian zone is very limited because the water table is dropped. So really common scenario in the West. So back into the main topic here, which is beavers. So beavers are what's known as a keystone species, which means that other organisms in the ecosystem depend on the presence of beaver in order to thrive. And so if the beavers are removed from the ecosystem, then it would change, basically in a negative way. Beavers, they create habitat for tons of other creatures. It creates wetlands, obviously, so amphibians just love it. Waterfowl, you see ducks in beaver ponds all the time, and certain songbirds are specialized to only exist in the riparian zone. Moose love beaver dam ponds, and muskrat really enjoy the habitat, and beaver lodges as well. And of course fish. So the main point here, and these are some pretty graphics I stole from Cows and Fish, which is a nonprofit in Canada that really promotes the use of beavers in restoration. The main point I'm trying to get at is that beavers create this ecosystem that is just pulsing with life and creates a lot of diversity in areas that, like here in the Rockies, can be pretty arid. So not just biological effects, but beaver also have an astounding number of physical effects, as you can see. They increase water retention, base flows. They can dampen peak flows. They can expand the habitat area. I'll show you some pictures. Increase groundwater recharge, increase wetland area, retain sediment in the ponds. They can trap contaminants. They moderate temperature, which is what I studied for my master's degree, and we'll go into that a little bit. They help with nutrient cycling and aggradation, that deposition I was talking about, and increases overall vegetation because of that increased flooding into the riparian zone. So here are some examples of increased size of floodplain. You can see here just the thickness of the riparian zone and how much water the dams can impede. I mean, I should have put a picture in the presentation, but there's this one dam in Canada that's like 2 miles long or something. I mean, it is just huge, the amount of water that these dams can hold back. And then also, like I showed you with that graphic earlier, it puts more water in the bank and it recharges the groundwater. And so that can be really important during drought times, like especially or in dry summers. It can really help kind of create a steady amount of flow in the streams. Beaver dams can be a natural filter. There have been studies that have shown that contaminants in the water get trapped behind beaver dams, and so it can help clean up contaminants in the watershed. It slows down the water, so it can help reduce the effects and reduce that incision that I was talking about earlier. And beaver dams also can control temperature. And so what I found for my master's was in that Bridge Creek picture I showed you, they implemented these fake beaver dams, which we'll talk about. And so we found that essentially downstream of some of the beaver dams, there was this cool water upwelling effect. And then also the daily fluctuations in temperature were dampened. So fish during really hot times in the summer weren't exposed to what could be lethal in some areas of the creek. It remained in non-lethal zones for fish, for endangered steelhead. And so beaver at this point in time, they're widely seen as a tool to ameliorate the effects of climate change, especially in places like the Rocky Mountains where it's predicted to get more and more arid. Beavers can be a really great tool for holding back water and putting more water on the landscape, basically. This idea is using beavers as a restoration tool came about in 2009, but wasn't published until 2014 by Michael Pollock. So Bridge Creek, where I studied for my master's, was under Michael, and that was the site of this initial project to use beavers as a tool for restoration and use them to combat the incision. And so from there, it's really just exploded. And so now there's this Beaver Restoration Guidebook in 2000. I mean, just in a matter of 4 years, the idea went from a paper to a guidebook that's being applied all over the country, actually all over the world. And so from the first paper, so here's the kind of the main concept of the paper. And it's very similar to that other conceptual model, but you stick beaver dams in there, and essentially what you see, you start with A here, and move over to B, and what you see is that the dams are washed out because the flood flows can't access the floodplain, and so it just becomes this really fast chute of water during flood flows. And so what he was seeing out there on Bridge Creek was that, man, these beavers, they just need some help. These dams, they just can't last because the flows just get so high in this incised setting. And so maybe there's a way that we can help stabilize these dams so that the beavers can thrive. And so the idea is if we can stabilize them and hold back some of this water, then the sediment will deposit and we'll build back over time the bed elevation. Obviously beaver dams, they're not totally permanent, and so it's this process of putting some dams in and then putting more in over time, more and more layers and layers. I mean, that's what happened over eons with beavers, right? And so what you end up with is kind of what we started with pre-fur trapping, which is a really rich, complex valley that is just totally filled with water and bursting with wildlife. So yeah, so here a little slide about the first Beaver Dam Analog project. And so what a Beaver Dam Analog is basically like a fake beaver dam. There's a bunch of different ways you can do it, but they tried, I think, 4 different methods. One was just stabilizing existing dams with fence posts. So you just take a hydraulic fence post pounder and just put some fence posts right into an existing beaver dam to help stabilize them. Or you can build fake beaver dams like this one, where you put in the fence posts and then you weave in some, say, willow, and basically create a fake beaver dam. Or you can just put the posts in and just see if maybe the beaver will come and colonize it. This one, so here you can see, like, look at how incised it is, right? See, this is my backpack up here. It's like 15 or 20 feet of incision in most places in this creek. The BDAs were like probably this tall as the table, so they're pretty big structures, but they're super cheap to install. But yeah, so Bridge Creek, it was incised, which then leads to homogenized habitat because of the incision basically doesn't allow for channel complexity to be around, and so they installed 100 of these Beaver Dam analog structures with aims to restore floodplain connection over time and see a measurable increase in fish production, which they have. They just published last year a study that showed all this intensive monitoring that they did, and it was an amazing increase in fish population because of this project. So like I said, it's now a widely used restoration technique. The cool thing is that it's process-based, so it's, you're working with nature here, and it's really, really cheap. It's like for this project, for those 100 structures, I think it was like $20,000, which is absurdly cheap for restoration. And this particular dam is also beaver approved. So the beavers decided here at this one that they liked it. And so they came in and added to it. So these were the ones that were laid by humans, and then the ones going parallel to the stream flow, beavers put in and decided that, hey, I like this and I think I'll add to it. So that was pretty reassuring. This last year, there's been a lot of press in recognizing beaver as critical creatures to the ecosystem. Most notably, I'd say this movie came out earlier this year. The Beaver Believers was a really cool film about people like Michael Pollack and Sherry Tippie and Ben Goldfarb, who have just been huge promoters of using beavers in restoration. And so then Ben just recently, I think this spring, published this book, and it's been getting a ton of press. He's actually touring to Missoula with this book September 29th. He'll be in Missoula speaking about this book. It's been on radio shows. He's been writing all kinds of articles. So yeah, it's been getting a lot of publicity, which is great. And so in response to this science and recognition that beavers are keystone species and that, hey, maybe we should try to manage them, there are at this point 5 states with state management plans. The most recent one that was written is Utah, and that's kind of the epicenter of a lot of the research being put out on this technique of using beaver in restoration. And so Utah State is working very closely with state agencies to manage the state of Utah beaver population. And in Montana, I just wanted to say that we currently, at this point in time, this is very common for many states, there is no limit on the number of beaver that you are allowed to take as a trapper. And in the areas in the western part of the state, I think the season is 6 months out of the year. You're allowed to take as many beaver as you want. And in the whitish area, in the eastern part of the state, 9 months a year, you're allowed to take as many beavers as you want, trapping. So I just had a little personal plug here for all of you. That I want you to try and help save the beavers in your career, or at least be educated about how important they are to the ecosystem. So, okay, moving into part 2 of the presentation, I want to talk about the Beaver Habitat Assessment project that we've been working on here at Clark Fork Coalition. It's been a project that started in 2014. At first, we created a habitat suitability model, where we basically made a model that looked at what areas of the Lolo National Forest had the best habitat for beaver. And so from there, we went out this year and field verified the outputs from the model and did a habitat assessment to identify some potential future restoration sites. But the overall long-term goal of this project is to increase the beaver populations in the area. And so here's an example of what the model output looked like. This is just for one small corner of the Lolo National Forest. So this is the Lolo Creek watershed, but it's like a, I think, 200 million or something acre area that this model was applied to, but it's hard to see with the scale. But what you're looking at is this is the Lolo Creek watershed right here, and these areas that are green and yellow are essentially the best habitat that was identified for beavers to exist. So, you know, does it have enough food for them? Is the valley wide enough? How steep is it? That type of thing. And then this past year, we partnered with the National Wildlife Federation, with Lolo National Forest, with Montana Conservation Corps to do this beaver habitat assessment. And this was the part of the project that I was really involved with. And what we did we set out to answer 3 primary questions, which were: where is the best beaver habitat in the watershed? Where are the current beaver colonies residing in the Lolo Creek watershed? And are there areas of good habitat that are currently unoccupied, i.e., can we then maybe attract beaver to those areas with some BDA projects? And so we collected data in partnership with the Montana Conservation Corps and and with the Youth Conservation Corps. So we had 2 crew leaders from Montana Conservation Corps, Jenny Cam and Heather Leach. And throughout the summer, it was a 5-week program, and for each of the 5 weeks, they took out 6 different middle school aged kids to the creek, and they camped for a whole week and collected data for our habitat assessment. And every week I would go out and check on them and kind of oversee the project. And this is Andrew Jakes with National Wildlife Federation, who joined me also one of those days to talk to kids about beavers and why they're important and why we're doing this work. So it was a really fun time for the kids, but also a really successful summer of data collection. And so the goals of the surveys were to inventory the existing beaver colony sites, and then also identify future sites / best beaver habitat. And so the metrics that these kids collected were pretty simple, but you can glean a lot of information, not just for beavers, but also for fish. So we looked at the wetted width of the stream. We looked at how wide was the valley. What is the gradient of the water surface? So how steep is it? What kind of substrate material is there? Because beavers will use mud and sticks and things. And so you need to make sure that if it's super rocky, beavers aren't really going to want to colonize there. And so we were looking at that. We're looking at how incised is it? So could it be a potential site for restoration? How much water is there? I was trying to get, by looking at depth and the width of the stream, I was trying to figure out how much water there was for beavers, because they like water, good deep water to hide from predators. How much food was there for beavers? So we looked at number of plants and the thickness of the stems of the plants. And then also whether or not beaver are there now or had been there recently, because if they were there recently, chances are they'll want to live there again. And so these crews, they were super, super amazing. They surveyed 134 reaches over a 5-week span, which equates to 33 miles of stream in the Lolo Creek watershed. They collected data at 402 data points throughout the watershed, and we reached 30 middle school age kids who are now Beaver Believers. And so from here, we are going to analyze the data and look at where was the best beaver habitat, and where were they currently residing. So perhaps we can place our restoration projects in areas next to where they're currently living so we can help expand the populations. From there, we'll install some pilot projects and monitor and evaluate these projects on their impact to native fisheries. We're working closely with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and University of Montana and the Forest Service to do monitoring on these pilot projects. So, okay, so that's that project. Now we're going to move to the Upper Clark Fork watershed, where the Clark Fork Coalition has been working for quite some time. In 2005, we bought a ranch called the Dry Cottonwood Creek Ranch, and perhaps some of you have heard of it. It's located, so here's Butte. So it's downriver, kind of near Racetrack, the Racetrack exit, or the Galen exit, if you guys know where that is. So right where Dry Cottonwood Creek flows in, that's why it's called the Dry Cottonwood Creek Ranch. We own 3,400 acres along 4 miles of stream, and it is right smack dab in the middle of the giant cleanup project. And so we operate, we have 140 head of cattle on the ranch, and we sell that as grass-fed beef. And then we also farm 200 acres of hay, alfalfa, oats, and then we've also implemented dozens of conservation projects on the ranch. I'll talk about a Beaver Deceiver project that we put in, and also water conservation measures. We also just turned the property into a conservation easement, basically. So the land will be preserved in perpetuity. So here's a little map of the ranch. So we own kind of both sides of the river along about 4 miles, and then some parcels up the Dry Cottonwood Creek watershed, and we rotate cattle throughout. So the Superfund cleanup went through the ranch property from 2014 to 2016, and we've done a lot of complementary restoration projects on the property as well. And I will go into a few of those. But, you know, owning this ranch really gave the coalition the landowner perspective and dealing with beavers from a landowner perspective. And the reality is that they are often seen as a nuisance species, right? I mean, think about it. They come in, they plug your culverts, they flood the land, they eat all your trees. What a pain. So, we have adopted some methodologies and learned how to work with them instead of eradicating them. And so here's just some pictures of what beavers are really commonly known to do, which is plug culverts with mud and sticks and cause flooding over roads. And so you can put in these things called Beaver Deceivers. essentially what it is a fence around the inlet and outlet of culverts to deter beavers from building dams right there. I mean, it makes sense from a beaver standpoint. All I have to do is plug this little hole and boom, I've got a nice pond. Here's an example of one right here in Butte that was put in 2014 by Amy Chadwick of the Great West Engineering. She's also someone we use as a local a contractor to install beaver restoration projects. And here's an example of a beaver deceiver that was implemented right on Dry Cottonwood Creek Ranch in 2013 alongside with Skip Lyle. This is Skip Lyle's design where, so this is the outlet of the culvert, the downstream side. So basically what you do is you put this fence around the outlet here, you put a pipe in with another fence around it so that it just really ensures that the beaver can't plug it. So even if they were to try and plug right here, then you still have water flowing out. So safety measure. And see, did I want to say anything else about that? I don't think so. You can also do some really cheap ways. There's some cheap ways of doing this. This is one that we put in for only $30 on Galen Spring Creek. It was implemented in 2016, still holding. And all it was just some a hog panel and some fence posts. Works great. And then the cool thing was, so this was like a constant area that the beavers were plugging on the ranch. And the cool thing was the next year, 50 feet downstream, the beavers said, okay, well, if I can't build a dam here, I'll just put one downstream. And so they built a dam just 50 feet downstream from the crossing. So it was a win-win. The beaver gets to live, we get to have our crossing, all is well with the world. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some Beaver Dam analog projects we've done on Modesty Creek, which Modesty Creek flows into the Upper Clark Fork right across from the where Dry Cottonwood Creek comes in, so it's on our property. We did a channel reconstruction project on the mouth of this, so we basically, the creek had been rerouted for farming way back when we bought the property, and then we basically put in a brand new stream channel that was, had a lot more sinuosity and was a better condition than what the stream that was there. And so as part of that restoration project, we added to the new channel some Beaver Dam Analogs in 2017. And so here is a picture of our volunteers that helped with the project. We installed 35, I think. No, not on this creek. That was in Perkins. Sorry, we installed like 5 or 6, I think, on this creek. Anyway, it was all done by volunteer labor, which is fantastic and very affordable. And they had a lot of fun doing it. Look at all their smiles. So here's a completed Beaver Dam analog. And so it functions a lot like a natural beaver dam. You put in these posts, you can put in the 2 layers like they did of posts, and then you put in the material. It immediately started ponding water. It created this nice little side channel so fish can go up around it. And it created a pool, and it sorted out the sediments. In a lot of Beaver Dam analogs that I've seen, it creates really nice spawning gravels down here for fish. So it just creates a lot more complexity and more diversity in the types of habitat that you see in the stream. The other thing was that in Modesty Creek there is a pair of beaver that currently reside there, and so we were trying to help them be a little bit more successful. So here is this exact same BDA 1 year later. So this was a picture I took about a month, 2 months ago now, a month and a half ago. So as you can see, it's still functioning, but at this point it's filled in with quite a bit of sediment, which is neat to see because Modesty Creek has a lot of sediment in it. So it's a nice way to create some habitat that maybe doesn't have sediment all over it. You know, it's a little bit washed out, but we can go back in there and we can put in a few more posts to help it continue functioning, or we can add more. I mean, the nice thing about this restoration technique is that it's very flexible, and it's not meant to be permanent. Okay, another project we did was on Perkins Gulch. So it's not on this map, but I put the circle where Perkins Gulch is. It's a very small little drainage that flows into the Upper Clark Fork, just kind of south of Dry Cottonwood Creek. And last year, this project was put in May. So this picture on the left was right after implementation. And then the picture on the right was just 1 month after implementation. All this sediment had been trapped behind. There was a big storm event, and a whole bunch of sediment washed into the stream and had deposited and had done its job in helping target the incision that was in Perkins Gulch. So, I mean, just within a month, this project was effective at battling this incision. So that was pretty neat to see. So this is the creek where they installed 35, I think, BDAs on this small little drainage. So we're expecting to see quite a bit of change in this watershed. And this was a project that was implemented by Amy Chadwick contracted out with WRC, the Watershed Restoration Council, which I think you guys have probably heard of in Butte. And that is that. So for now, I'll take some questions. Yeah?